What goes into projecting first free ascent winter lines in New Hampshire? That's the subject of today's chat with Jon Nicolodi, a humble MBA student and hard mixed climbing hardman. Those are my words because he certainly would not describe himself that way. Surprisingly, John's only been mixed climbing a few years, but has established some big winter FFAs in that time. The routes range from M8 to M11, and all are on some of the most prominent walls in the state. In an Alpinist recap describing a few of the climbs, Rick Wilcox, who is one of the most accomplished mountaineers in the area and a trailblazing climber in his own right, described what John is doing as state of the art as far as difficulty goes for New England. Listen on to hear about John's search for balance, how he trains, and get a great play-by-play of Cathedral Direct Direct, a 7-pitch 512B M11 WI5 route that he freed with Chris Saulnier in February of last year. We'll get to our conversation shortly, but first, a word from our sponsor. Blue ice is the best kind of ice, and also my choice when it comes to fast and light ice climbing gear. The aerolites go in like hot knife through butter, and their climbing packs hit the sweet spot between function and lightweight. Designed to get to the point in the Alpine, the gear is tested by mountain professionals between the Alps and the Wasatch. If you're looking to get to the point too, and with a little less weight in your kit, check out Blue Ice's gear at blueice.com or your favorite local retailer. Just going to kind of jump right into it. For today, I really want to cover your mixed climbing. And in the past few years, you seem to have really jumped on the map with some big winter first free ascents in New Hampshire. And I'll give just titles of the climbs and their ratings that you gave them. But these would be Across the Great Divide, M8R 5 pitches on Cannon Cliff, The Resistance, M10 5 pitches on Mount Washington, and Cathedral Direct, this one's a long one, 512B, M11 WI5, 7 pitches. We're going to go into them in a little bit more detail, but what motivates you about climbing hard, complex routes like these?
Yeah, I think you actually just found is I'm just trying to stack as many grades behind each other as possible. Just for complexities and absurdities. There's an element in the wintertime where it's awesome that stuff is frozen and it's almost expected to be dirty. So when you're going up new stuff, it's not like, oh, I'm going to have to like polish this up for rock climbing and scrub it down, or even like the choss is frozen in. So there's that kind of like lazy element to it. That is a reason why I don't necessarily do first ascents not in wintertime, but there's also an element of it too, where it's just like a sense of adventure. Like I love ice climbing. I understand too, like that idea of like, oh, the ice forms in different ways and it can be really fun from year to year, depending upon how things form. I get that. It just doesn't like necessarily fire me up as like, oh, wow, I'm going up this pitch and I have no idea what's going to happen. Sometimes the failure happens pretty early on and the uncertainty is resolved, but sometimes you're just still finding new things around the next corner. And I think that's the constant alert for me of like, well, what could happen?
So you really like the questing, and the climbs that you're doing require a really diverse set of skills. So just for context and a little bit of how we got to today, can you talk about your progression in climbing and then how that's led you to hard mixed lines?
Yeah, I started rock climbing in college. I want to say around 2011 or so. And it was definitely kind of like a piddling around at cliffs, like setting up top ropes and kind of like top rope soloing and placing gear while I was doing that. It was one of those things that was like kind of book led and not so much mentor led, doing, sketchy and not so sketchy stuff with friends and occasionally learning from more advanced peers along the way.
Were you at Hammond Pond, by the way? Because I saw that you went to Northeastern. Go Huskies.
Yeah, right. I definitely did some bouldering at Hammond Pond for sure. And Quincy Glorious too. That was a bit of a stomping ground for sure. But Northeastern used to have and still has a lodge or, a facility, kind of a space in Shelburne, New Hampshire. And so I was up this way in northern New Hampshire more weekends than not throughout my years in Boston. Though I definitely learned to love Boston throughout as I spent more time there. But I spent a lot of time up in the woods in New Hampshire. And part of that was I did a lot of hiking and loved that, and also kind of like got it out of my system for the moment, if you can say that. But anyway, so at some point I got into ice climbing, probably like 2013 or 14 or 12, somewhere around there. and then moved out to Colorado to work with the Outward Bound School, which was a curious time in my life because, of course, there's so much great climbing to be done there, and definitely like a lot of peers that in that Outward Bound School that were getting after it and showing me the ropes and how to crag and climb hard and do all that kind of stuff. But it's also really intensive work, and so it's just like, oh, great! Like I just spent a summer with a backpack on running expeditions in the field, and so my like quads are massive. But it's been a second since I've climbed anything much harder than just 5, 6 or chossy terrain with students. And so that said, though, definitely in the bursts in between those two, spending time in the desert or doing a trip to the Black, which is like time and time again become my favorite kind of stomping grounds out there is going to the Black Canyon. And then in the wintertime, Leadville, Colorado, where the Outward Bound base is really close to Vail. And so kind of getting my teeth a little bit wet in the mixed climbing and ice climbing there. And then I also spent a winter in Ouray, kind of tangentially doing some work still for Outward Bound, but also doing some roof shoveling just to make ends meet. And I actually didn't spend as much time as I should have in the ice park. That's for like, why didn't I do that more? But I did a lot of sweet backcountry ice climbs. Like I had a pretty good season that year. I would say that that's kind of been a constant progression of mine through 2015 to 2019. I would say until late 2019, just like taking like, yes, I've been climbing since 2011, but there've been years where maybe I've climbed, like there've been 8 months where I haven't climbed at all just because of work. And so in 2019, the fall, I kind of started to cycle out of that expeditionary work. I worked for Croak Expeditions, also in New Hampshire, and it cycled out of them and it was kind of moving to more outdoor expedition office roles, if you will, and then starting my own independent consulting firm. And so that's when it clicked for me. And I was like in one place, sleeping in a bed, showering, and like had evenings and afternoons and weekends to go out and go climbing. And so that's, yeah, I think kind of a key part of that progression of like, there's a lot of awesome work you can do in this world and kind of figuring out the time and place to do that makes sense. And there'll be time for everything. It's just kind of like when you find it, I think is a really curious part of how paths work out. And so I think, for me, finding difficult climbing and like understanding what that looked like and felt like, and how to project really. Like, I don't know if I project to climb before 2019 at all, rock or mixed or whatever. Figuring out how that all worked through friends and partners kind of in the last, what is that, 3-4 years has been pretty crucial. And I think, yeah, being in one place for that period of time through the pandemic and up to now, well, let's discard now. We'll talk about now later. Now's a bit different. Has been pretty crucial in how that paints the picture into some of the things I've done the last couple of years.
The change in circumstances seems to coincide with your like hard climbing. But before actually I ask about that, were you questing earlier on, like when you were out in Colorado and like with Outward Bound as well, or?
Yeah, with Outward Bound, we do a lot of questing. There's like a
Sure.
lot of like chossy passes and mountaintops that aren't really recorded that we do with students. And so in some element, yes, like there's an unknown there, but it's rarely harder than 5, 6, but you're doing it with like 8 students who are terrified and usually starting at like 2 a.m. because you don't move too fast. So there's a component there, but I would say that, the adventure of mixed climbing and projecting around here definitely wasn't something I did out in Colorado at all. That would be incredible. There's a lot to do out there. I can just imagine myself questing up in the Black. I'd be dead if I did that in the Black Canyon back then. Maybe even still now, if I did that, I would die probably.
What well, so you started doing more like back office jobs and you had nights and weekends, and that seriously seems to have changed your style and then your approach to climbing. So do you mind just diving into that a little bit more? Like what's changed since then? Because yeah, I mean, it sounds like you've gone a lot harder, more intense, more complex.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, part of it is definitely just not using my body for work has been a huge component of that. Like huge props to folks who do. And I, you hear the training regimen of like carrying around cinder blocks to get strong for mountains. I believe it and buy it, but that's like pretty brutal work. And for me, I don't mind doing it with some weights. And so that's like definitely a component of it. It's like, oh, well, it's raining. I have time after work. I'm going to do some training. And so learning really how training worked with that free time in the afternoons and evenings when it wasn't possible to get out and climb. For that period of time, I was working with the Appalachian Mountain Club in their leadership training and risk management department. And so it was a pretty standard job through 2020 or so, or mid 2020. And I started my independent consulting firm in the summer of 2020. And that's when it was still office work, but the flexibility that I had severely increased to the point where I could really pick the days that I was working, aligning with the weather and with partners. And probably to a detriment, like there was a period of time there where I was almost climbing too much. I didn't like have any like wild injuries per se. I've definitely like had some over the years, but I think that yeah, there was a period of time where that flexibility aligned, and that was awesome. I'm currently, I've closed that consulting work down that I was doing, and I'm back in school doing a 2-year MBA program at the Tuck School of Business, kind of really buckling into not climbing too much at all right now. So it comes in waves.
Do you tend to oscillate between things like by nature, or is it more by circumstance, do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a bit by circumstance. I will say, like, another reason that I didn't always like, I love climbing road trips, but to a certain point, I definitely hit a wall where I'm like, all right, what's happening with my life right now? Like, I like the diversity in my life. And yeah, Outward Bound had a climbing element to it, but it was team dynamics, interpersonal growth, and leadership development. And that was the driving force throughout that, and gave me a lot of fulfillment. And so that's an important part for me, is like, what is that fulfillment that I'm looking for outside of climbing? And I think kind of like the constant next question, I guess, where I know that like and I think that's where I am now, which feels good, but is also terrifying and also a little stressful, is that I know climbing will be there for me. I'm just kind of like setting the building blocks for the next stage, if you will. I definitely wouldn't say I'm like an all or nothing person necessarily.
What would your friends say?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, maybe that's where we need to get a roundtable going again. Just like pick each other apart. But yeah, I think maybe I am. I don't know. Yeah, is this going to be a revelatory podcast for me? I might be learning.
I just ask questions, man.
Yeah, right. Oh, really? We're not. I'm open for answers here. Okay. Jeez.
I think the going rate for psychiatrists or therapists is like $100 an hour. So if you want,
Okay. Yeah. All right. I'll start Venmoing you now. See how it goes. Yeah. All or nothing. I don't think so. I think it is partly just coincidental. I know for me, if it's all climbing, I'm not, totally excited about where I am in my life, though, in this moment, that sounds awesome. And if it's all the other way, like it is a little bit right now, I'm definitely looking for the light at the end of the tunnel. So trying to find the balance for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like having balance and longer term considerations are important to you. And I know that plays into the way that you actually project route, because you take a lot of protection with you. And so it's not about just, going into the unknown. What attracted you to Outward Bound and this sort of leadership space? Because you did it for quite a while, and it seems like maybe that's something you still want to pursue going forward. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, it's a good question. It definitely is as really pivotal, I would say, to who I am. But I think, kind of starting from the beginning, is I did an Outward Bound course as a youth, as one of the youth a long time ago. And so that was a pretty formative experience for me, I would say, kind of growing up. And it wasn't something that necessarily like directed who I would become, but it just like kind of opened my eyes to what's possible. Not even from the world of employment, just from like what we can do as humans, I guess, if that makes sense. And then kind of like working with the Outdoors Club through college kind of showed me like, oh, like, yeah, this is something that you can do for fun, as lead trips and hang outside with people and do that. And then slowly getting into that work in the few years after college, before working with Outward Bound. When I did cycle back around to Outward Bound in 2015 as an employee, like there was a lot of connection and resonance that the values held that may be slightly carried over from those 2 weeks as a youth, and maybe they're more, kind of inbred throughout the previous years that I've had. I guess I'm not entirely sure, but without a doubt, when I think about that Outward Bound work, for me, is it's a really intense connection to believing in others and believing in the power of what we can achieve and what folks are capable of, not just in the outdoors, but in their own interpersonal mental space, and what they can really do with that belief, I think is really important to me. And it's something that I definitely is a big part in a phase of my life where I'm right now, actively, looking at the next steps and of my career in a more traditional business sense. It's something that it either really relates with someone and they get it and they understand, or it totally goes over their head.
Hmm.
I feel so strongly about a lot of the values that Outward Bound has that I'm totally fine with that. If my story doesn't sell at all to the person I'm talking with, 'cause it's like, yeah, that's fine. That's just the way the world works as it is. Like, CPAs don't necessarily, like, their story doesn't resonate with me, though I certainly value that line of work. And that said, that line of work probably really resonates with the person that I'm talking with, where I'm like, I was an Outward Bound instructor and then a course director, and this is what I believe in. In the short term, like, I definitely don't see myself cycling back to that. I also don't necessarily see myself working with nonprofits in a paid role in the short term, just kind of with regards to what what my financial needs are coming out of a.
Well, MBAs are quite expensive.
Yeah, yeah, it's kind of like I need to it's some metrics on return on investment here before I cycle around to nonprofit work again. When I think about the long term of my career, and I actively share this with people that I'm talking with about employment right now, it's like, yeah, I'd love to be back in that nonprofit space and that leadership space. And definitely, like, maybe not a mentor, but someone that I look up to is Peter O'Neill, and he was the executive director when I was there. And he's since moved on. He's the executive director of the Uray Ice Park right now. Was an Outward Bound instructor, went to business school, did the business thing for a while, and is cycling back around. But he's like, yeah, sunsetting his career. Like, he's probably doesn't have that many years where he's like ready to clock in at an ED level. I don't know though. I don't know him that well. So sorry, Peter, if I'm speaking
mentor
for
from
you.
afar.
Yeah, exactly. That's something that I really look up to. Another one that clicks for me when I think about that is Mark Ritchie, someone who's like has that diversity of both, like, in the mountains, but also is doing really incredible things with their passions outside of that. Like, I very much respect folks who can blend their passions with the mountains, no doubt about it. But that's just not how I personally click. And so folks like, yeah, Peter O'Neill or Mark Ritchie, who have that diversity of skill set, are folks that I look up to, and I'm like, oh yeah, they're making it work for sure, which is really cool to see.
Do you approach your work and your climbing and your passion projects in a similar, like, enthusiasm and go-getter attitude, or do you take a different sort of like tact with each?
Yeah, it's a good question. Maybe one story to paint a picture potentially would be, so I wanted to live in Carbondale, Colorado, which is a town that's like pretty hard to find reasonable rent in, and I was kind of, and still kind of am, a cheap bastard. And so I was like, okay, I need to go back to, like, Pennsylvania to visit my parents. So, and I have a chunk of time of off work because I just worked my face off for the summer, and I have a job lined up in like a month. I'm gonna build a tiny house in my mom's driveway with this month that I have. And I didn't tell her that. I just showed up, and she was on a trip. I think she was visiting my grandmother, and I would wake up at 5 a.m. and go to sleep at 11, and I'd work on this tiny house, and I'd stop for dinner sometimes. I got it done in that regard. And so perhaps there's so many things about that were unknown to me. I'm really bad at drawing, and also my handwriting's awful, so I didn't really have schematics. It's just things that were in my head that I was bringing to fruition on that palette, if you will. And I made loads of mistakes and things I'd totally do differently throughout that. And of course, the main problem with building a tiny house isn't so much building it; it's then where do you park it? That's the thing that people don't think about. They're like, oh, I'm going to build a tiny house. It's like, great.
It could fit anywhere. It could fit in your palm.
Yeah, right. Where are you going to put it? It's like, are you then going to buy land and put it somewhere? Why don't you just build a house? But anyways, I wasn't going to buy land in Carbondale, Colorado. That's for sure. And so then I had to, like, I have a 1982 Toyota pickup truck that I put on the back of and drove it out to Colorado. I think this was like 2017. And I had to, like, I was cold calling, just like driving out ranches and farms, asking them if I could live, on their property essentially, and pay them a meager amount to do so. And eventually I found a really incredible family and parked it behind their blacksmithing shop for 2 years, I think, in exchange for, like, some ranch work and some money here and there. But I suppose I share that story to paint the picture that, maybe there is an all or nothing aspect of it. There's an aspect of time, I think, that's important that I haven't maybe mentioned yet, or like that was crucial in that. It's like I had a month, like this is it. And there's a moment of that month where I was like, oh, I hope if I can't get this, am I just gonna have to live in my mom's driveway for the rest of my life? Like, yeah, just like complete panic. That was like really unreasonable. And I think that that's true of some of my projects too, where it's like I knew that this would happen, that I would need to pivot my career and go back to school and potentially have a more traditional job to set myself up for the next couple of years of my career. And then maybe after a couple of years, couple, 5, 10 years of career, circling back around to have a little bit more flexibility for climbing. And that's just kind of how the ebb and flow goes. And, within that, thinking about all the other aspects of life too, with regards to starting a family and that kind of thing. So there was an aspect where it's like, all right, like this is, yes, there's an aspect of conditions here when it comes to working and projecting these routes. But I also, yeah, I think I do feel some element of time where I'm not so young anymore either, like definitely not old, but time.
You getting gray hairs?
Oh, that's a great question. This morning I found one and it was like double the length of all my other hairs. It was super weird. And I just pulled it out. I was like, what the hell is this?
It wants you to know.
Yeah.
It's
right.
there.
Yeah, right. It was a long gray hair. I was like, I was more worried about how long it was than how gray it was.
Like it was sucking the resources from all the good hair. You're like,
Is that how that works? Yeah. Well, you can't tell I'm wearing a hat right now, but there's not that much hair up there.
I'm going gray.
Are you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just the dark hair. You just see it easily. Yeah, I mean, you sound like you're very decisive. I don't know if you've always had this like sense of urgency, but it seems like there's a time dependency crunch where you really sort of accelerate. How did you start going into mixed climbing and then into the hard mixed climbing itself?
Yeah, I think that comes from just wanting to. I think what I love about mixed climbing is that there's almost an acceptability of failure, where it's like I am like I'm on rock, like a lot of stuff, could be loose, it might be a shallow pick, and it's like, yeah, I could whip off this at any time. And I feel that way at so many points when I'm mixed climbing, and it's like typically safe. I'm able to make it safe with gear. Sometimes it's not, and you got to keep it together. Or in some cases around here, it is bolt protected mixed climbing, and that's pretty, joyous in some regards. So that's one aspect I love of it, and just like that uncertainty, that ability, and recognizing the acceptance of failure, the variance of it. Like I've definitely done some mixed climbs where it's like that I've done them enough, where it's starting to become like as repetitive as ice climbing might be. Like I think ice climbing on the whole is pretty, the ice is varied. I love climbing ice, don't get me wrong, but as far as movement goes and engagement, to me sometimes it feels a little dry. And so that's where mixed climbing stepped in. And there are mixed climbs I've done enough that have felt that way. And so there is, has that possibility to, you just, the beta and where the stuff is. Then getting into hard mixed climbs, I think for me is that aspect of challenge. And it's like, one, understanding what the next level is, and also two, seeing lines and being like, oh, I want to do that. Like, what does that take? What does it take to do that? And so part of it is building that repertoire of things that have already been done, which has been awesome. There is like a lot of hard mix stuff around here that's been done. There's plenty I haven't done, either because I haven't got around to it, it hasn't come in a while, or it has and I haven't been free, or I got smacked down by it. I don't know, any variance of things. But part of it is, building up to things that I want to do, and also just like loving that. I definitely love challenge and trying hard. That's definitely something that in this moment of time I really enjoy, both about mixed climbing and about rock climbing. And yeah, I'm sure at some point kind of in my climbing career that'll taper off a bit. But in this moment, the challenge aspect of it really draws me in for sure.
What was the process that you went through to actually start like going after these big hard climbs? And how did you find like candidates for the routes that you were doing?
That's an interesting question, because so at least in New Hampshire, there's a lot of history, which is awesome, and a lot of opinions around history, which is also awesome. And so it's almost like kind of finding the balance between the two, if you will, about like where it makes sense to go forward from here. And I guess maybe starting with the history point is that like there's so much that has been climbed in all sorts of different styles, both in wintertime and in summertime. And so just by nature of it, we have so much there's so much less rock here than there is in other parts of the country. But there is this incredible year-round climbing ability if you have the desire to do the various disciplines, which is awesome, and it makes it a really great place to live. That said, though, you know, where the conflict and definitely like without a doubt, where damage to rock arises is when you start to get on rock routes in the wintertime. And that's something that's really come up as, you know, as a point of controversy and has seen points of resolution in the Mount Washington Valley, that maybe we'll get into here and there with Cathedral Direct. But that's an important part of it, is like knowing where the rock routes are is like one of the first things I do, where it's like, and I don't just like look at the main, I look through 3 guidebooks. Like guidebooks drop information left and right for whatever reason, either to make them shorter or just condense them. The new one for North Conway Rock Climbs Tom Mullen has done a pretty good job of bringing back in old info to make a pretty comprehensive thing. But even still, then it's like, okay, well, that's great. And that kind of like gives you passage for wintertime, I would say, more or less. But then there is also a component too that I've become more attuned to as I get, you know, I'm also a really avid rock climber. So for me, part of the equation is like, oh, well, like, is this a good mixed climb or is it a good rock climb? And that's like a question that I kind of have various decisions and questions around. So that's like part of the question in there. And if it's a rock climb, I'll tell someone else about it. Like maybe one day I'll get into like scrubbing lichen and removing a lot of Chaucy rock, but it hasn't happened yet. There's so many good rock climbs around here. Then it's like, well, what's been done in wintertime? And sometimes that doesn't matter. Sometimes it's like, oh, this is an awesome, I don't care if it's a first ascent. This is awesome. But inevitably, if I check it out, I'm like, wow, has this been done before? Does it have a name? Like, what's the history? There's a component of ice history as well, where it's like, there's one guidebook, it's like 3 decades old or whatever it is. It's very old. But then there's a wealth of info on the internet. And it's just like, how deep do you want to go? And it's like, there's Instagram posts from like all sorts of different players throughout the years. There's the Cathedral Mountain Guides blog of old is like a primary source of info across all the different players. And even still, like last winter, I was at Lake Willoughby with, I think, Pete Gata and Alden Pellet. And Alden's like a pretty old climber of New England scene. And we were just kind of walking around figuring out what to do. And I was like, Alden, has that been done? Like, and it's a line I'd seen years ago. I was like, that's it. That's the next thing. He's like, yeah, Kevin Mahoney did it like years ago, or like decades ago now at this point, probably. And I was like, oh, geez, holy shit. And then that had the same thing happen again, like 2 other times that day, where I pointed out a line I want to do. And I think maybe there's one that Kevin had like bailed off of because he didn't have a bowl kit. And then the other 2 he'd done or whatever it was. It's like, oh my gosh, just like, talk about a machine. So then there's an element of just like local knowledge and things that have gone unrecorded. And so for all of the things I've done, it's like, yeah, I don't know, like when I'm doing them, like, yeah, it could definitely be a first ascent, but it might not be. And that's okay. And so part of the kind of decision making throughout that is like, what's acceptable with what I am doing. Like, yes, I've kind of checked the boxes, not a rock climb, good to go with regards to climbing in the wintertime. And I think it's a better winter climb, probably because it's really Chaucy. It's frozen together, which is nice. That's a pretty nice qualifier, I'd say, mostly in Huntington on Cannon, where it's like, this is frozen in the winter. Like, this would be terrible as a rock climb. So that box is checked. And then it's like, oh, well, I don't know. And so it's like, then where is the line with regards to pounding an iron and also placing bolts? One example where I messed up is going up on the resistance. I first went up that with Adam Bidwell. I'd climbed Pinnacle plenty of times. And every time you climb it, there's a looming wall of schist over your head that just goes into the skyline. And I'm like, there's got to be terrain up there. Like, it's just look at that. Like, it's absurd. It's wintertime. It'll be beautiful. And so I did that one time, and I went off the first belay of Pinnacle, went up a seam, went up a crack. It was like loose. It was scary. I was like, all right, like I could build a gear anchor here, but it kind of sucked. And so I pulled off to the left and I pounded in some pins and, hand drilled a bolt, brought Adam up, and then we rappelled. And then I found, digging around, find the ancient pictures of I've forgotten their names, the Russians who did the first ascent of that. Not Vasya, maybe, I don't know. And they're eating up that fat flake. And then it's like, okay, well, I put in a bolt on the route. Like, I tried to reach out to them. I called the first ascensionist he's a prominent Romney guy. I can't remember his name right now, but he's a really strong rock climber. And I told him, I got him on the phone briefly, told him, and he didn't hang up on me, but it wasn't far from it. And I was like, I tried to call back, and he had somewhere to be. He had an excuse. He's like, I gotta go. And I tried to call him back, and I think I sent him an email maybe and heard nothing. And I was like, all right, well, like, I put a bolt in already. I have some pins. The pins suck. Like, they added this line in wintertime. Like, it's good to free as a winter route in my head. And like, I built yes, there was kind of a gear anchor, but it was like where you would whip into off the crux second pitch, if and when you blew it. And so it's like, well, I don't want to put a gear anchor right there. And I've already put a bolt in. So I'm going to drill another bolt. And I did. And that's kind of like the decision-making that you do there, where it's like, yes, part of it's just like taking ownership, and part of it's that decisiveness where it's like, okay, like, I tried to understand everything I could. I'm going to make a decision and see what happens. And that's part of it is just owning that decision-making process. We just got wildly off your initial question about candidacy.
Let's keep going with it for now, but I want to circle back.
Sounds good. Yeah. So part of it is like, sometimes that happens where I see a line I'm psyched about. I quest up, and sometimes later I'm like, oh, this has seen passage before, because you find the evidence, or you see the terrain, you see it from a new angle, and then you see an old photo. And that's just how it goes sometimes. And then you react accordingly. So that's how the resistance played out. And it's like, all right, well, this is a sweet line. Like, we're going to keep firing it for sure. When it comes to across the Great Divide, that was something that Peter Doucette with the various partners have been up over the years. I think he'd done the first pitch or two in wintertime. I've never actually talked to them directly about it, but I think he's done. And it's also like the pitch descriptions are weird, because technically it's an A climb that was done in wintertime. And then Jim Surratt and Steve Larson freed the first pitch, which is this massive 130-foot pitch that kind of like goes up and then arcs around. And they freed it at 511. And I emailed or talked with Jim Surratt at some point. He's like, yeah, like, we thought about going, but it's just really loosey and chalky and not really worth it. And I know some other folks that had like repelled the Across the Great Divide and been like, this is a pile of choss. This looks awful for rock climbing. And so they didn't do it. But anyways, I think, and over the times of working with it, Sean Bunnell at one point did that as one full true pitch, which was beautiful and also absurd. Just like the amount of runners he had to use to keep it reasonable. And also it's like a lot of hard terrain. I'm like, holy shit, Sean. He was just firing through this difficult terrain and linked it in like the proper book pitch, if you will. Every other time that I've seen it, it's been in two pitches. And I think Peter Doucette freed those two pitches and then went, based on the gear that I saw, went about 30 or 40 feet past that into the next like traversing pitch. But what happened is Sean Bunnell saw him on that. I was like, yeah, can we, like, let's check it out. Like, it sounds sweet. Let's go check this out. So we went and checked it out, and Peter, was like, yeah, go check it out. Super gracious in that regard. And so that's kind of how that whole thing started. And it's like, oh, this is amazing climbing. Like, we should keep going. And so we just kept pushing the envelope further and further. That one was tricky because it's like, yeah, it's a long route. It's really complicated terrain. It's traversing. So if your partner doesn't know it super well, following it takes a long time. And so that was a tricky component of it with regards to like actually getting up in. So there's some reasoning for breaking it up into 2 days, which is what I did. And throughout everything I'm talking about, there's always an element of like, there's always a better style. Like, I'll always admit that. Like, that could be done in a day. There's things about Cathedral Direct Direct that could be, the style could be improved upon, which is a really cool element of all of this. Aside all the new terrain that's out there in New Hampshire. When it comes to Cathedral Direct Direct, part of that's, again, it's like just the talk of like, you hear, sometimes you just hear whispers of like, oh, that, that hasn't been done, or like that icicle keeps coming in, or is like, it came in really fat one year and it didn't get done, or like that smear came in and it didn't get done. And so you just pick up little things here and there if you stay in a place long enough. And so that said, though, Cathedral Direct Direct was one of probably the first whisper I heard, kind of starting and joining the area in 2019. Not that long ago, dry tooling in the Cathedral Cave on two routes, the Mercy and the Devil Made Me Dog It. I don't know if it was acceptable, but it wasn't unpermitted at the time, or it wasn't like frowned upon necessarily at the time. And so I joined and met for the first time Zach St. Jules, Brian O'Leary, I think Seth Fisher, and maybe a few other cats. But I had met them in 2019 for the very first time in there. They're like, yeah, come on out, it's raining. And that's when, and Brian O'Leary was working the work of the devil. And so that's when Zach was, I think the very first day I met him, he's like, yeah, this is one of the last things, to be done here. And this was the history of this place. And Jim Ewing put up the work of the devil with the idea that it would arc into and be a direct line up the cliff, up into the chimneys above Cathedral Direct, which had been climbed like by coming in from Pendulum Route, by Doug Madera and Steve Larson. I think they climbed, there's a dead tree that they front pointed up to get up the first pitch of Pendulum Route. And then they rock climbed across the Tempe pitch in mountain boots, which I tried to do 2 years ago. And I could barely even aid across it in mountain boots. Like I was like struggling. I was whipping horizontally across that pitch. As I think like Ray Rice was heckling me from down below about how miserable a time I was having. But that said, going up from the Cathedral Cave was kind of like, I don't know, I know like the phrase "the last thing," doesn't exist in my mind. Like, yeah, it's said, but that's never true. That was one of the, the lines of the area that it still had yet to be figured out, and had been envisioned without a doubt for quite some time. And so that vision, though, evolved as kind of the ethics within the cave changed, like as more folks got into winter climbing kind of in those years and learned about dry tooling on those routes. Understandably, they got more aware, things broke off, and it's like, well, wait a second, the community had a meeting in 2021, I want to say. And it was kind of like an outcome of that. I think it might still be on Friends of the Ledge's website. They kind of like hosted and facilitated that. Was like, well, wait a second, like these were rock climbs, and just kind of helps reset the standard for ethical rock use in the valley for the better too. Like as a rock climber with a very limited time, like I go and rock climb in the Cathedral Cave all the time now because I've got it's a 5-minute approach. I got 2 hours, like, and it's such an amazing resource for that. But that said, the arc of what that looked like over the last 4 years has changed pretty drastically.
So it sounds like there's a variety of ways that you get into identifying potential climbs. So you're just going out and just adventuring and looking for things that might catch your eye or strike you. And then there's learning more about history of an area and something that might compel you to say like, oh, this might potentially be something that hasn't been done before. And then there's also like the changing ethics of an area that even allows you to pursue something. Mm-hmm. But I mean, generally speaking, so you are exploring new terrain, but the first free ascents, generally speaking, so not completely new terrain. So is that a limitation of New Hampshire, just the amount of rock that there is, or is that something that you might, want to explore further going forward? Is just more like the unexplored?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that a part of it is, particularly on some of these like more prominent cliffs, yeah, just a limitation of what's been done. Like there's such a history of rock and winter and aid climbing throughout New Hampshire. It's been a place where people have really honed a diversity of skill sets and brought it to other places. And so that's shown just by, yeah, how many lines there are when you look at the Cathedral Ledge map. Like there isn't that much there that hasn't been unclimbed with regards to what would make sense for mixed climbing and kind of dry tooling to ice, I would say. There's definitely still like really, really hard rock climbs to be done there on very small edges and smears. But as far as, cracks, that's kind of all tapped out. I would say that's mostly true of Cannon and the Huntington Ravine, Mount Washington, the Resistance. That was a mistake. I thought that was new terrain. There's definitely new terrain up there, like no doubt about it. And it's awesome and steep. And it just so happened that made the very first possible left turn I could. And that's what they did like 2 decades ago. And so, yeah, I definitely hope to continue kind of, going out into new terrain and seeing what I can find. I do have some just free ascents here and there, but they're definitely scattered, I would say, and more on the single pitch variety, I think, if I remember right.
When you're researching a route, are you also looking at what other people use to climb the route itself? Because I've heard you talk about how you take a ton of gear up with you. So is it because like there's a component of wanting the adventure and wanting the novelty and like figuring out the moves for yourself, but you're also quite diligent about what you're going after. So I guess I'm just curious like what that balance is.
Well, I think typically if it's been done before, I won't bring two. There's definitely a limit there of what gear I'll bring. But yeah, definitely if I'm heading up on something that I don't know has been done, or kind of have that vision in mind, yeah, it is. I'm definitely armed, with a full pin rack and a hammer, and my partner's got a hammer and specters and terriers. Wide gear if it looks like it takes it, usually not if it doesn't. On occasion, I'll have a handrail, but not too often. That's very cliff dependent. That's just, again, based on like local history and just kind of local usage. And then also like a huge part of my kit is the power of a tagline, which is like, I think becoming more and more well used for sure. I don't remember over the years where I picked it up, but I'm like, oh, it is so awesome not to lead with a pack and not to follow the pack, and be able to leave some like extra iron or bail gear or just like gear I don't care. Yeah, gear I don't care about to leave behind, like on the ground, and my partner can send it up at a moment's notice, and I can hammer in some old tri-cams and be out of there. Like that's part of it. Particularly questing when I guess when I'm talking about this, like questing on Cannon, like to me, that is a place, there's so many corners there that you could go up and have no idea what's going to happen, which is an amazing way to spend a day and a pretty absurd way to spend a day. But it requires you to, have the gear to be able to get out of that situation. And, that's where the bail gear and the iron comes in for sure.
So like when you're questing, like how much gear are you actually carrying, like weight wise maybe?
Yeah, I don't know weight wise, but by the numbers. All right, let's say I'm going up on Cannon. I'm not bringing a bulk kit. Like there's bolts scattered around there. There's gear, and there's also just like there's rock routes there I don't know about. So that would be, there's so many rock routes there that I don't know of. It's got a lot of history, so I wouldn't bring a bulk kit. But with regards to gear, probably, and this is probably what I bring to the base, and then eyeing up, bringing probably less than this, but a single rack to 4, and this includes like micros down the C, like in the low C3s, probably doubles to 3 or 2, down to like Black Totem as the double range. And then part of the curious equation is like, well, what condition is the rock going to be in for doing this kind of work? Like if it's rhymed up, like you definitely, like, I guess regardless, I'm bringing tri-cams and hexes. I'm bringing a hammer, a couple specters, or a specter and a couple terriers. I'm bringing a partner's hammer, and then a pretty healthy pin rack, I would say. And I don't know how to quantify that right now, but probably like, yeah, I don't know, like 4 knife blades and a couple angles. Then I have like a bunch of like random nuts and like old gear that I found that I keep on a locker for bailing, just so I'm not always leaving my primo gear behind. RPs, nuts, just kind of a single rack of each, 12 draws, hopefully some ice screws. It's awesome when there's ice involved. Hopefully some ice screws. And then also too, secret weapon, ball nuts. I call ball nuts like the lazy person's piton, because they like go in incipient cracks, and like you can fire them in. They're so easy. You don't have to hang out and like finagle stance and like get it in just so get your pin in just so it barely stays, and then pull out the hammer and hope it doesn't fall out. Like it's ball nuts, you're just like firing in, and yeah, there's an element like hopefully it works, and where you're placing it's not rhymed up and it's not jossy, but a pin is feels a little bit more reassuring sometimes, but as far as like ease of placement goes, at least on Canon, I've been really excited about ball nuts. As far as like just free climbing goes, no doubt about it. Then that said, like I started to mention, like, what if it's rhymed up? Then it's like, oh, well, maybe like a single rack of cams and double your hex, bring everyone's hexes and tri cams, like bring out the Pennsylvania gal party, I guess. I don't know. But it's like, then it's like kind of, it's the game changes where it's like, it's like, you get into pure Scottish conditions where they're psyched about in Scotland. And it's like, wow, this is absurd that they actively choose to climb. I've never climbed over there, so I might be completely wrong. But yeah, climbing on the rocks. I think maybe that's how it goes. I don't know. Do you know? Do they just climb when it's only frozen up? It's only rhymed up if it's frozen. There's like a conditional there?
I can't speak to this authoritatively.
Yeah, sure, fair enough. Neither can I, but either way, that sounds absurd. And at least from my experience, when I go up to a cliff and it's rhymed up, it's like, all right, this game changes quite a bit. If I'm going up on stuff that I've been up on before and I just kind of like have a sense of what the cracks are going to be like, I'll either bring less or I might bring more iron, as in the form of like smaller beaks, essentially. Because it's like, yeah, those things hold. I don't know, it's kind of like incremental protection in some regards.
Yeah, I mean, partly why I'm asking is because you are taking quite a bit. But I've also heard that you're described as quite methodical and like very impressive to watch when you're climbing. Like it seems like you're always sort of like in control. And I'm curious about like training as part of your progression, because it does seem to be a fairly rapid rise. You had like periods of 8 months of not climbing, the 4 months of climbing. And so I guess I'm curious about maybe with your transition in 2019, like how that affected the way that you were able to prepare for these climbs and sort of push yourself a little bit more. Is that of interest actually to you?
Yeah, we can totally talk about that. I think that's something that, is sometimes is a taboo topic, but I think is, really important to talk about. And it's very nice. Yeah, methodical is a nice way to put it. And impressive is also nice. To me, controlled also means slow and boring. So methodical and impressive are two very nice words to use there. And I think that is, there's a key component that is important there for training, where it's like, at least when you're first ascending or you're doing more trad based mixed climbing, it's like it's an endurance marathon of how that plays out. And so training with that in mind is really important. And I think maybe kind of to that point, there is an aspect of it where there is like a goal oriented mindset, depending upon like what the project is. And so maybe I'll get into that as well. One thing I want to start off with is, and so this is the physiological advice from, someone with no backing at all and an MBA student, is that my understanding is that for rock climbing, like, which I train for almost year round, just in the form of max hangs or whatever, like tendon strength is like way more finicky and it's just way harder to develop. And so on the whole, for ice climbing, you probably helpful to have tendons, but you don't need them like you do rock climbing. And otherwise you're using, like, in the scheme of things, pretty large muscle groups. Like, yeah, your forearm's not as big as your quad, but like you can develop your forearm strength in comparison, much more so, and the rest of your upper body strength much more so than you can with tendons. And so to me, that's always like a huge encouraging point and something that I try to like belabor with folks when I talk about training. Like, yes, with like, this isn't transferable to rock climbing training. We have to be a little bit more methodical and careful with regards to injury and progression. It's like, and yeah, you probably shouldn't like go and start to do like absurd weighted pull-ups, but it is something that you should be able to build up to, just with regards to my take on our body's ability to physiologically adapt over time. For me, what that looks like, and so it varies by season, where it's like, I'm not really training for winter over the summer. I don't have a board. For me, it's also like, I'm really psyched about rock climbing in March. And then in November, typically a switch kind of flips and I get really psyched about winter climbing. And so I try to like prelude that with some training, but on the whole, like maybe I am one or the other. I don't know, but I'm all or nothing, I guess. No, that's definitely not me, but my fiance would get a kick out of that. But anyways, so when it comes around to wintertime, I kind of have like a base, and I have some issues of shoulder health. So part of my base training is around that with regards to kind of overhead work, dumbbell weights. Part of that I also loop in is like calf work, like the amount of work that I sometimes I get more of a calf pump than an arm pump in the early season. And so kind of trying to curb that because the calves are immensely important. Pistol squats, and then adding weight to those, whether it's the form of like holding weights, dumbbells while doing pistol squats. And then, of course, the rest of the stuff is weighted too. When it gets into weighted pull-ups, for me, those are like immensely important with regards to both the form, whether they're like brief lock-offs or just like good form but not lock-off pull-ups of a certain amount. And I'm pretty regimented about timing how long it takes me as like having metrics. Like I'm learning now being an MBA student, like what true data analytics is, and I don't have that. But as far as like training goes, I think I got some metrics where it's like how long it takes me to do X number of pull-ups, including rest time, or like how long it takes me to dead hang for 6 seconds non-continuously, if that makes sense. That way there is a benchmark there kind of going forward. Adding weight to these. Another thing I'll do, and this happens like this is like pretty project dependent, but weighted figure fours is something that I'll do again on like a time scale. And that's really only, there's no figure fours on the resistance. There's like 3 or 4 on the work of the devil. There's some in other places in New England I can think about. It's not something that you need to do too often here, but it's like a pretty important trick to have in the bag, I think. And it's not bad training. So I'm not doing too much of that right now, but I'm also not climbing much right now to use it. No, I'm like psyched about figure. There's nothing I'm doing that requires figure fours right now. That's for sure. So that's kind of like a niche thing to build up or throw into. I think that mostly covers it. And then I try to keep up with max hangs in the winter with some success. What I was curious about the Cathedral Direct Direct is that it was a 12B. It starts off with a 12B pitch that was icy, and it also is very cold. And it's also like kind of my anti-style. Like it's one of the more bouldery 12Bs, I would say, in the Mount Washington Valley. That part of that was also keeping it with max hangs, but also just like maintaining my rock climbing power through campusing throughout all last winter, which I was really not that was hard, to be honest. I was like not psyched about that. That was just like borderline overload. But I was like, this is what I need to do to like maintain this and also send this 12B when it's got some icy holds and it's like 25 degrees out or whatever.
Well, so you mentioned Cathedral Direct specifically, and that influenced the specific types of training you were doing campusing.
Mhm.
And well, let's actually let's talk about the specifics of that climb. So you and Chris Saulnier pieced it together in February of 2023. It was the climb that we talked about earlier on with the very long grading system, 512B, M11 WI5, 7 pitches. I know that a lot of the listeners are interested in the climb itself and what went down. So can you just share an overview of the climb and how things went that day?
Yeah, for sure. Maybe and probably beneficial. Just kind of thinking about the arc of the season. Like I talked a bit about the training for Cathedral Direct, and then part of that too is just like going and climbing that 12B pitch and figuring out how that's going to work in wintertime, because the cave seeps a little bit, and so ice comes down. It's like, where's the ice come? Where's it form? Like, what holds can I use to make this work as a rock climb in the wintertime? And so, and every time I'd go up, I would go up kind of like 8 up hanging the draws, and also like remove some like icicles that were coming down and just see what was iced up and what wasn't. And so that was like a key condition that had to be in consideration for making it all happen. And also just like a key part of like the build up into it was like, that before this, that was definitely not the rock climber done the most. Now it probably is, just to like have it really wired so that wasn't the barrier to entry there. So there's like a constant work and kind of scoping of that. And then throughout a little bit, I think again with Sean Bonnell was the main partner. Again, like I'd never sent the work of the devil, which is the dry tooling extension. I would say at this time, that's the only thing that in my mind is acceptable to dry tool in Cathedral Cave. Just, that's a totally different conversation, but and someone's trying to rock climb as a free climb, which would be awesome and nails hard for sure. And when that happens, like my position would change again to like, it's a rock climb. But in this moment of time, that's the only thing that's in my mind acceptable to dry tool in Cathedral Cave. That I was working and had never sent until maybe early 2022 or so. figuring out the bit on there. And the clipping holes, it's like it's bolted. It's bolted well, but it's weird how just like the positioning of it is above a pedestal. And so if you blow the second clip it just the right way, you probably deck onto the pedestal. And so like really just like figuring that out was pretty crucial and part of the lead up into it. And then it was a matter of conditions above that. And also too, one crucial component of how this all worked is that for years they're like, okay, we're gonna climb the devil, climb out the work to hit a curtain. And I've looked at this thing for years and I'm like, wait a second, the curtain forms like 20 feet left. Like that's nowhere near where that tops out. Like, what are you what are you talking about? And so part of the equation was like, all right, well, and there's that time element that we talked about. It's like it's time to just like figure out what happens above this. Because regardless of whether it hits ice now or it hits the bare glass in the chimney like 20 feet from there, this is to me is like the vision of how this could work so long as I solve the next like 40, 50 feet of terrain that Jim Ewing hadn't bolted in the work of the devil. And so that was part of the equation too, was one day with Sean, but I think it was like a rainy day and like all the ice was coming out of the chimney. And I was like, Sean, we need to figure out what happens above this. And so he's like egging me on. I'm going up there with like pins, working some, it's like just hammering above this. And I'm like doing the calculus. It's like, all right, there's like tons of ice funneling out of this. So far, it's all funneling left. At some point, I made the call to quit it after I like hammered up some beaks and pins in that seam and lowered off and called it. But that was part of the equation, was how to figure that out and part of the process from like November onwards. Another part of that that's interesting is that I think within the last year or two, one of the rock climbs had been extended so that there are now like bolts 5 feet from where I was traveling in that new Chaucy terrain above the work of the devil. I clipped their last bolt, like leaning way over. It felt like really sketchy. And then I ended up at their 2-bolt anchor. I was like, all right, great. Like now I'm just like using bolts of a sport climb, get up this, like this, and it's like way over there. This feels really silly and contrived. And I just finished like a bolted mixed climb to like beaks all of a sudden to not, and it's not to a ledge either. It's just like to a hanging belay. And so that's where, and you talked about decisive earlier. And again, with that time component, I made the decision. It's like, all right, I'm extending this bolted climb by 3 bolts. And it's like, that's, the decision, the artistic statement, whatever you want to call it. That's what I'm going to do. And instead of ending at their 2-bolt anchor at a non-stance of this sport climb extension and like continue that constant controversy of like mixed climbing on the sport route, I'm going to drill my own 2-bolt anchor on a ledge literally 5 feet above that one. And so that's what I did. And that's like one of those decisions where that's like, yeah, that's an artistic decision or, a decisive thing you have to do. And you either hear about it or you don't. And that's just how the world works. And I'm pretty okay about that. So that all happened. And Chris and I went up the week before to try Cathedral Direct. It had just dumped and snowed a bunch. And so we're like, we don't know how this is going to happen. Everything's sloughing off. We're going to head on up. And so we head on up. We're doing really well. I think we're above the cave. I sent above the cave. And then we're starting up into kind of the first chimney pitch, which is just awesome climbing. It's like verglass, dirt. There's like a tree stump. And then all of a sudden you're in the off-width climbing. And you're like climbing up off-width to then like frosted up like leaves. And then you're stemming up more into cracks and you get to essentially the left edge of Bonfire Ledge, which was that's kind of how we marked out the 4th pitch. And I think on that first attempt, I just by fluke whip out of there at some point. I'm like, all right, well, this is over. We're going to keep going. And so we keep going. We kind of go up and we turn the corner, what would be the 5th pitch. I'm like, all right, well, this is just not frozen at all. Like nothing's frozen here. I can see moss is not frozen. I'm looking at like, it's not vertical. It's slightly off, slightly less than vertical, like number 4, number 5 crack. I already burned my number 5. Like this isn't going to work out well. And there's ice here, but I can't use it. And so built a little anchor, lowered off, and then we wrapped and called it a day. And like, okay, maybe depending upon conditions, it'll firm up a bit. And I think for that next week or like week and a half or so, I like walked at Cathedral. Every day I was working, I'd go for a walk at Cathedral just to like suss out conditions. And if I was getting out, I was climbing at Cathedral And I was like, all right, we're going to go chimney climbing. And so there's like a handful of things you can climb on Cathedral that are fair game in the winter that are chimneys. And so I was like, all right, we're going to go, yeah, we're going to go chimney climbing. And so not with, I don't think that was with Chris Sonne, but just with like different partners. We'd go questing up some dirty chimneys at Cathedral just to be in that mindset of being in a dirty chimney. And so then I think it was both schedules. I think maybe Chris Sonne took off a Thursday. We showed up and it was a week later, and a bit of a freeze had happened. Ice Fest was happening that Friday after, and it's supposed to be like a wicked cold snap. So it's like, all right, we got a day. Then I'm guiding this weekend for Ice Fest, and then who knows what happens after that. But it definitely feels more and more like seasons are shortening on Cathedral. Like it's just like, yeah, it's happening. Like there's less climbable days down in the lower elevations, and Cathedral is coming into play on that. And so I was like, this, let's give it a whirl. And so we did. And I think again, like sending above the cave, one of my boot zippers broke on my Phantom Tex, which was, I had a bad gear year last year. Broke a boot, and I also snapped an ergo in half. Or like not in half, but like I broke off the first position of my ergo. Not on this climb, but elsewhere. But anyways, there's, my zipper breaks. And so, we're taping my boot back up. And one thing I think a crucial element to talk about here is the elements of partnership. This climb was awesome. And one thing I try to do, like, regardless of if I know the answer, is like, hey, like I'm game to take this pitch, but do you want it? And sometimes the answer is no, and sometimes it's yes. And for that day, once we got above, it was pretty clear that I was like getting us above the cave through that technical terrain, or not technical, but through that steeper terrain, because the rest is pretty damn technical. Above that, we were swapping leads because Chris was like, yeah, could I take this one? I'm like, yeah, sure, that sounds awesome. You totally should. And so he cruised the first chimney pitch coming off the ledge. And we, again, for context, so I think, well, we talked briefly about gear. I'm a connoisseur of shoes, apparently. Like I brought 3 pairs of shoes on this because I had my rock climbing shoes for the first pitch, and then I had my comp boots for the second M11 pitch, and then I had my ice boots, my Phantom Tex for beyond. And so we actually, it must have been my boots. I don't remember what was in the haul bag, but we had, that great moment where you throw a haul bag off a ledge 3 pitches up. So that was a fun component of it, just like offloading some stuff. But even from there, we were still hauling with a tagline, probably some surplus iron, some extra ice screws, and then parts of Parker or 2 in a haul bag just to make seconding fun and fast. And so, going back to the first chimney pitch, Chris fires that, gets us up to Bonfire Terrace, and I follow. And then I take us around on that next pitch, get past my previous high point, and it's just like, it's just where it needs to be. Like, it's just barely iced up. There's still like twigs poking out. Like, it's not like the trees or like the twigs are like fully even iced in. It's like they're just barely iced up enough to like, tickle you in the face as you kind of like wiggle your way by. And what I remember most is just like felt like not so much as far as like actually being dirty, but it just felt like dirty climbing, where it's like I had 1 tool in ice, the rest of my body was like in a number 5 crack. And I was like, all right, like how much of my body do I put in this crack? How much do I commit to the ice? And it's just like, it ends up being like a mixture of the two for the sake of security and what I need for progression. But it's just like amazing, diverse climbing. Like, I don't know of a better way to describe it. And then eventually popping out of that 5 crack and ending up in a spot of Cathedral where I'd never been, like beneath the final head wall, essentially, of Cathedral Direct. I think it's like, 3 p.m. Chris follows up, takes the next, like just fired up to take the next pitch. I'm like, hell yeah, this is awesome. He sets off. And initially I'm like, we're home free. Like, I see the ice in the chimney, like he's going to cruise this. And he did a great job. The thing is that what I was looking at wasn't ice. It was like fern snow inside of the chimney that had like a small like eggshell layer on top of it. And so he was like stepping into like, he was like tunneling away just enough fern snow to like punch through. And like he was placing screws in some and like leaving it intact. It was just like a bit of a China shop effect kind of going on with regards to the delicacy that he had. And I think he also, like, the way the ice was forming, it was like he got in the chimney and he was like, I think there was some regret involved. I don't want to quote him, but I know he took his helmet off at one point so he could fit through, like just like an ice constriction with inside the chimney. And then he popped out, and by the time he got to a belay, like way above me, it was dark. And so I like put on a headlamp and followed. And then part of this equation is like, well, what does it mean to send? A definition for me is like, I don't want to have to lead every pitch. Like if my partner's psyched about leading, they should take it. Like that sounds awesome. I did follow like either follow or led every pitch clean. And so that's like yeah, I guess that maybe that's an important part of the definition. I don't know. I'm not really too concerned about it. But I was worried. I was like, if I fall here, like, what is that? Yeah, whatever. It's like, you just kind of get over it and you're like climbing in the dark with a headlamp. And I had to like push the bag got stuck in the chimney. So I was like, like pushing it up. And then I pop up and it turns out from there, it's like some mixed steps through the rest of the chimney to top out in the dark. That one goes pretty much without incident, but we top out and it's like, oh, wow, I can't believe. There's always a moment where you're like, wow, I can't believe that worked. And that's kind of what I love sometimes about mixed climbing, and sometimes even ice climbing, whether it's like one pitch or seven. It's just that like, wow, that's incredible that actually happened. And there's definitely a feeling of that for that. And then in the next feeling, I was like, oh, shit, I didn't know I'd signed up to guide the Friday of the Ice Fest. So I was like, I don't guide too often, just for the Ice Fest. And I got a text. I'm like, oh, I'm late for the guides meeting and I'm guiding tomorrow. And so we run down and go eat pizza in a fantastic, silent celebratory moment at the Ice Fest, having just sent like something you're really psyched about, but also don't really want to talk about it yet. It's kind of a funny place to be in.
How'd the pizza taste?
Pretty awesome, I think. I remember being really famished. And I was also just like dirty. Like I was just like a dirty, sweaty man.
Just boots are falling apart, probably new holes in your jacket.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, that was an interesting start. A good start to the weekend for sure, without a doubt.
What do you look for in partnerships, and like what do they mean to you?
I don't know if I don't like have like a checklist, and I think there's always an element of it too. Where it's like, I wish I could climb with more people than I do. Particularly right now where I just have such limited time being in school. Like, I wish there's definitely like folks that I wish I could get out with and people to meet. And so that's an important part of it. Just thinking about enjoying time outside with others and constantly building new relationships is important to me for sure. When I think about the partnerships that I have cultivated over the years, or that people have cultivated with me that I really appreciate, it's a friendship outside of climbing that's important, an appreciation of what's going on in someone else's life. It's an understanding of like sometimes things come up and you're not psyched, and sometimes you're really fired and you are psyched, and you're trying to accommodate each other and where things are at. That willingness to like explore and fail is like hugely important to me, particularly in the wintertime of like, yeah, I guess, yeah, let's head up this corner and see what happens. And it's like, and I'm usually pretty cool. Like sometimes I'm that driving force and have that vision, and I'll like always like, I'll come off after like down climb after 15 or 20 feet being like, yeah, I don't want to do this. Do you want to? And if they say like, doesn't really matter to me whether they say yes or no. That's all a variant depending upon not necessarily who the person is, but just what kind of day they're having. And so being open and willing to that is just kind of what I try to bring to the table as far as accepting, where they're at, both in the scope of their season and the scope of their day is important, and kind of the reciprocality of that, not having expectations of me to go, put the rope up or, get anything in particular done. I think for me, a big part of why I enjoy climbing and why I've kind of moved away from, just kind of like a remnants of potentially like playing soccer for too long in high school was just like, when it comes to this outdoor recreation stuff, like I don't need someone's expectations to dictate my behavior. And so, having an understanding and around, what that feels and looks like informally I think is important to me for sure. And a really also key component of partnership in the wintertime when it comes to like this kind of questing stuff, both for, what I offer and what my partners offer is ability to give like really long belays. Like when Sean Bono quested up on Across the Great Divide, he was the first one that I know of to like try to go and free the A4 pitch. And it was I gave him a 4-hour belay on that. Like we crushed to like the top of, what is now pitch 4. We were there at noon, I think, which was just like, I can't believe we're here. Like we were both fired up. And then he goes, and as I described earlier, he goes and he links he didn't know this, like he was kind of like just like aiding, questing up. He goes and links what would be the crux pitch. And he's just like, yeah, I'm just going to continue into this next one. Might as well. And it ends up being a horrific affair where he's like, he's slung his ice tools. He's like hammering his ice tools in on aiding them up. There's some sort of like 30-foot rope that's dangling down, tantalizing close to him. That's, I guess, a rope that got cut in the Whitney G. It was just like a relic there. And he's so excited when he gets to it. And he's like, there's a bite in it. He's about to clip it, and he gives it a yard, and it just like comes down and disappears into the depths of the dike. And it's just and eventually he makes it up. It's just a horror experience. And it's a belay that I gave, and I have certainly received back from him at some point throughout the years. And so that's an important element of what it looks like to give and receive that, for sure. At least when it comes to more of this, there's plenty of times where it's like, yeah, let's go fire off some pitches. But when it comes to this element of a bit more uncertainty, I think that's a pretty crucial component of it. It's just as far as the logistical nature of it goes.
The golden rule of belaying.
Yeah. Given you shall receive. Is that what it is?
Something like that.
Yeah.
It's probably in the Bible.
Yeah, sure.
The climbing Bible. So climbing and life-wise, what are you excited about next?
I'm in a full-time MBA program, and also then pursuing full-time summer internship, and then hopefully rolling over into a full-time role after that.
So you can hire Jon this summer, listeners.
Yeah, yes. I'm open for hire. Yeah, that's a great plug, I guess. I didn't think about that one. And so when I think about that, and we've talked a bit about kind of that oscillation back and forth. I just got engaged this past fall, which has been awesome. We just got a puppy. And so there's definitely, a consideration of balance amongst all this. And I think that's what I'm most excited about, like right now, where I haven't gotten out a full day on tools yet. I've gotten out half a day, a couple hours at the pig pen, and like half a day somewhere else. And we went and climbed an ice pitch this past weekend. And that's about it. And so I think, there's an element of that where I hope it's more in the future as I seek balance. And I'm also really excited. To me, there's such beauty in that dichotomy of using my mind and skill set kind of in the leadership or business world, whatever that turns into be, and also pursuing, this lifestyle in the mountains. And I think that'll be really challenging at times, and I'm sure there are plenty of folks out there that are like, you are an idiot. Like, why would you want to be, a weekend warrior, essentially? But there's some part of me that's excited for that. Like, I'm excited about the new challenges that business school is bringing and what it's forcing me to think about, and amazing people I'm meeting through it that climbing hasn't necessarily offered. It's definitely built what I've brought to this experience, but it hasn't always offered everything. And so I think what I'm excited for about is bringing the two more into a harmony as the years go on, and as things like building a family come into play, and helping other folks recognize that too. Like, that's kind of a common thread about who I am, is helping folks, if they want to, recognize that they can also do really awesome things, whether it's mixed climbing, absurd climbs with 3 pairs of shoes, or just having an awesome day out on a Saturday, being a voice of empowerment for that kind of in the world of contradiction and balance. I think for me is what I'm excited about going forward.
If you'd like to hire Jon, you can connect with him at Jon_Nicolodi on Instagram. His last name is spelled Nicolodi. I'll also share a few articles that highlight his other climbs, which we didn't get to in this episode, in the show notes. And if you're interested in a deeper dive into Jon's training, you can find a mini episode on Patreon. We go into a typical routine, weights, reps, and sets, how he structures things throughout the year, among other details. The link is patreon.com/IceIceBeta. Thanks for listening. See you all next week.